really glad to have y'all with us today. As you can tell, we are keeping it real this morning. This is going to be a fun live tour in a home fruit planting. And so you're going to get to see a wide range of different fruit crops. So I just want to welcome you to our Home Fruit and Vegetable third Thursday for July. So we are hosted by the Home Fruit and Vegetable Work Group. And so you can see that Gregg and Seth are out in the field. We'll go to them shortly, but we also have Melody and Lee and Darby and the whole crew kind of running Q&A.
Well, first off, I'd like to welcome everybody here to the plateau this morning. Beautiful day. And yes, this is just moisture wicking from me. I tell you what, if you didn't know better, Celeste, you would think I was in the field in Jackson. It's already that hot and humid here. And my learned colleague, Mr. Seth Whitehouse, and we're going to kind of tag team back and forth about talking about some of the issues with growing grapes and blueberries and caneberries. And if we've got questions, we may field a few on apples as well. But we're going to start out talking about the grapes this morning. And one thing that, you know, we do a lot of programs early in the season talking about, you know, what to do, site selection and, you know, soils and all these things. We talk about some of these products, but one thing about in season gives you an opportunity to do is really step back and look and see, am I doing a good job with my cultivar selection? Am I doing a good job with my spray control, whether it be disease, whether it be insect, whether it be fungal diseases, you know, which ones are resistant, which ones are not resistant to the different pest problems I might have? Where am I at in terms of my vegetation control? And basically, you know, and as we tell master gardeners all the time, if you keep really good records of everything, your pesticide applications, your successes with your vegetables or your fruit crops, to where you can duplicate those successes or eliminate those failures, you'll be way, way, way ahead. One of the places where I really wanted to start out talking this morning was actually about those cultivar selections. I know if you've heard us mention many, many, many different times, just the importance of doing a good job and doing your homework in terms of finding those right cultivars for your particular area. And what might work great here in Crossville may not necessarily work out in Mr. Lee Salmon's county. They might not. And so do your homework. And a lot of that homework may be a little bit of trial and error on your part. There's a few varieties that we'll discuss today that, and even techniques, particularly as we get into the caneberries, that might work for you if you're in Upper East Tennessee or up on the plateau. But if you're out in West Tennessee, you're probably not going to be techniques that may work for you as effectively. So I want to start out talking about just cultivar selection. And here in this home orchard or our home vineyard here, I'm going to start out with 3 different varieties of grapes so that you can just easily visualize the differences in terms of health, in terms of disease pressures, and which ones tend to be just really flourishing and which varieties need to be that are not so much flourishing. And to my left here is one that is called Norton. It is a American hybrid, a very popular grown grape variety here in the Northeast and the Eastern U.S., and particularly here in the South. It's one of those varieties, if you're a homeowner, I'm going to probably steer you towards growing this because in terms of black rot pressures, and we'll walk the camera around here a little bit, it's a very, very healthy, and you can see by the old bull cane that's growing out here, a very vigorous growing plant. Another one that I've got right here behind me is one that's a what my dad always called a New York Concord. This is probably the latest ripening grape that we have here in our vineyard. It's the most vigorous grape that we have here in our vineyard. We've got it on a double curtain trellis here. And really, as you've heard me probably talk about in the past, you know, I encourage homeowners to a single trellis, single wire, because this thing, man, grows just crazy good. And you can see another big giant bull cane really not a lot of disease pressures. And the Concord's typically not one that we're going to recommend, though there may be some cultivars of that Concord that tend to be a little bit more resistant. We've got one back over near our caneberries that we've had growing here for about 25 years. And so it's adaptive and it's growing very good. And it would be one from a homeowner that if I said, that one flourishes in my landscape, I'm going to take some cuttings and I'm going to propagate that and I'm going to grow that one. At the contrast, we've got one over here, and I believe as my colleague follows me, I think this is Chancellor, which is one, if I'm not mistaken, and I say not mistaken because when my dad passed on a lot of these, we weren't labeled, and I was going to label them last year based upon the grapes that we harvested. Well, because of winter injury, we didn't have any grapes last year. So it's hard to tell you what grape variety that you're growing if you don't have any fruit to really gauge off of. You can see this one really just substantial Japanese pressure, lots of black rot in this grape. This is a variety that's really struggled, and I've tried to baby these for the last few years, trying to get these to grow. But ultimately, and you can see there's 4 of those canes down through your trunks growing of this particular variety. And then right behind it, you have a Norton. And you can see in row with it, just flourishing, and we don't have any issues. And so you can basically tell, and looking between the rows, these are all different varieties. And when you come to a variety that is hardy to cold injury, resistant to disease pressures, those can tend to flourish. Seth, you turn back around here, you can kind of see on this, again, what we call the New York Concord, just growing more vigorous. The vines are tremendously out here, and just a very healthy plant, very durable type plant. And so, if you're a home gardener and you're interested in growing your own fruits, I can't stress enough. Do your homework on your cultivar selection. Do your homework on disease resistance, cold hardiness. The time that you spend doing that will be time well spent. And so I encourage you to do that. Now, I want to transition a little bit into some of the canopy management that we might do on some of these grapes. That would be a mid-season. And if Seth, you'll just kind of follow me along over here. As you can notice, you look underneath here, you don't see a lot of vines hanging down underneath the grapevine. And the reason for that, a lot of these, as we come through mid-season and we've got these great vines that are hanging out here in the row or hanging down, we're actually going back in and pruning those out. And the reason that we're pruning those out is because we want to leave as much airflow moving through here. Again, hot, humid, wet in the southeast. We want to try and get as much drying as fast as we can. We want to get as much airflow and sunlight through here that we can. And so we're going to kind of try and keep this pruned out. Another reason why I like that singular high wire, because we can open that up to just let a little bit more airflow. And Seth, if you turn, you can kind of see one over here that we've kind of got it trellised to the bottom, how much deeper that kind of goes in. Now, one thing about running 2 wires or a double curtain that you can get into is the fact that you can grow more grapes per acre. But how many homeowners are interested in growing grapes per acre? And so for a homeowner, I would encourage you to focus on those maintenance and pruning and making it a little bit easier for you to get through and kind of move through those and open up the canopy for life. And
hey, Greg, we got a question I want to toss to you while you're standing here with some of these older vines. We had a question about how old this planting was. And I thought, while we're standing here looking at some of these older vines, you might give a little bit of history.
Actually, this one is not as probably old as you would think it would be. This particular trunk is probably maybe 10 years old, maybe. Some of these others that have not grown vigorous, a lot of times it may be like a tree. This one right here may be a little bit behind it, maybe another at 5 years or something. But this is just not a vigorous plant. The big trunk is the vigorous growing plant. very robust, lots of energy. It grows real fast. This one, smaller leaves, not very aggressive in terms of growth, a little bit harder to maintain. And so from an age-wise, yes, there's a difference in age, but probably not as much difference in age as you'd think there would be. And that just goes back to the vigor of the plant and its hardiness for that particular environment. So a lot of times like vegetables and things that we would say.
Yeah. Well, and I was thinking about even your pruning practices, some of the cane renewal can kind of disguise sometimes the age of the.
Yeah. And so in terms Dr. Baumgartner mentions cane renewal. This might not hardly be as good, but you can see a little bit. And in terms of the trunk here, I've actually started a second trunk here to kind of grow that one in over time. And I generally like to keep two trunks growing because if I get winter injury to one, I can come back and basically have that second trunk to grow off of. Grapes will have a certain lifespan, even though I can show you some Concords here in a few minutes that literally have been here on this place 25 years. Just very hardy. They're just hardy to this environment. And so one thing that I have, and I've heard Carol Reese talk about this, there's cultivars in your particular area that may not thrive in other parts of the world, but they may thrive in your area. So try to look and identify those cultivars that are going to be successful. So as we move on around here, and I'll just look at a couple more vines here, and I'm going to kick it over to Seth. As a part of that mid-season canopy management, this is what we call a bull cane. Really big, long, giant, aggressive cane that's growing out here. Not one that I'm going to use for fruiting in the future just because these nodes are so far apart. This is a cane, while it may provide a lot of energy to this plant, it also does a lot of shading to this plant. And this is one of those that as an end season, just to get more sunlight into the canopy of my grapes, I may come in here and do some in-season pruning just to remove all those bull canes. So a couple of things that's happening here. We pruned underneath to open up, to let air flow through. We've taken out some of these bull canes to let some sunlight into these grapes. Remember, with fruit crops, sunlight drives energy and sugar content. And so we want to make certain that those grapes are getting enough air and sunlight to not only dry the plant and reduce disease pressures, but also really bump that sugar content up. And hopefully with a good wine crop here, that sugar will be really high in this and we can make some great wines. But there's other methods for doing vegetation control. And a lot of times I will use Japanese beetles as a part of my management practices in terms of thinning this canopy a little bit more and letting some sunlight into the grapes to help them, again, drive that sugar up and reduce shading in those plants. But there's a fine line with that, and I could actually probably take you over to the lower portion of the vineyard to where the Japanese beetle's done too much damage to it. And I'm going to kick it over to Seth and let him talk a little bit, and he can show you and visit with you about the leaves and talk a little bit about the pressures of the Japanese beetle.
Perfect. All right, Greg, if we can show a picture of maybe one of those leaves that had that damage from the Japanese beetle, we can see, actually, a few of them just rolled off right there. We can actually see the window pane effect where they've kind of skeletonized and left that vein of the leaf on that plant. And like Greg said, this does help the sugar content of the fruit. However, if we get to a certain threshold where this might be actually damaging the crop, we do need to consider potential spray. So, a general guideline here, and, speaking of that Japanese beetle, we can show a picture of what it looks like. It's a tiny metallic beetle, not to be confused with a June beetle. That'll be another metallic one that's much, much larger. But we got to consider our sprays. And so we know Japanese beetles, they're going to spend the majority of their life actually in the soil. A lot of people ask me, hey, can I think about a systemic insecticide to put in the soil to actually manage for the Japanese beetles? And that is actually not a good method. They're very mobile in the environment. So even if you try to control them in your yard, your neighbor or a mile on the street might have a large population that can come over to your crop. So it's important to try to knock down that adult population when they start to show significant feeding on your leaves. And so we'll move on over to the other side of the orchard where we can see some of that significant feeding from the Japanese beetles, where they have actually skeletonized entire leaves. And so we'll show an example where maybe it might have been better to spray earlier to fight off those Japanese beetles and push that pest population back down to not cause significant feeding. So one example here, you can see where this might have had too much feeding. And you're really just seeing the stems of the plant and not really seeing any foliage here. And so that's going to cut down on some of our photosynthesis that the crop can actually uptake and help for the plant to thrive.
And Seth, one interesting thing about it, for those of you watching the video, look at the difference in the variety, how one particular, and again, these are older, more vigorous trunks here. So these have been these are real healthy type plants, but preferential Japanese beetles like these grapes compared to the Nortons that we just walked away from.
Oh yeah, and carbaryl, if you want to show right here the damage of the Japanese beetle, we have a few adults that were actually killed, and you can kind of see are just going to slide off into my hand right there. So it is an effective product to utilize, but there are other methods. Another thing to keep away from is traps or pheromone traps. One example, this works great for stink bugs for trapping as a trace pheromone trap. But for Japanese beetles, we are not recommending these pheromone traps. They'll actually encourage more populations to come towards the environment and cause potentially more damage. So that's one other thing we want to keep away from. Moving on to potential preventative insecticides. A lot of people consider neem oil if they want to go towards more the organic control method. And there are repellent properties in neem oil that can also help out with keeping insects away from that feeding damage. And that's one of the examples of what that neem oil will look like if you buy it at your local, garden supply store or whatnot. Carbaryl 7 is probably going to be the most effective. There are other organic methods like pyganic, which are a very low concentration of a pyrethrin, but might not be as effective there. Gregg, you sprayed this how many days ago?
Yeah, a couple of days ago. And just to make a couple of mentions about that. Mm-hmm. So with, there are a number of things that you could use. And he mentioned the pyrethroids, the permethrin that you could use as an organic approved label. Some of those you need to be careful and understand how effective they were. This orchard should have been sprayed probably a week ago. And most of the damage that you see occurred within a week's time of me seeing it one time and telling my niece that we needed to spray, and coming in here a few days later and just seeing the devastation that they can create. Well, one insecticide, for instance, like imidan, which is an organophosphate, will work to kill adult Japanese beetles, but it may take days for it to work. Compared to the carbaryl, you may go down through here in carbaryl and spray a row on both sides and pull away. And by the time you put the tractor up, the Japanese beetles are dead. So the timing of application is critical. The other thing that you must keep in mind is what is the withdrawal period? What is the reentry level after you spray it for doing any work such as pruning, but also thinking about what is the post-harvest interval, and which kind of leads us back in. If we talk about some of these products, we've got some black rot going on here with this grape. Mancozeb is probably one of the most effective pesticides that we can use for spraying those. But at the same time, Mancozeb has, if I'm not mistaken, a 66-day post-harvest interval. So it's one that I'll use starting very early in the spring and then use other sprays as we move through the season.
Yeah, but I want to throw in a vegetable note there, which is that, for those of you who are active, common, your disease and pest management in your garden very well, some of the same products, but the rules surrounding their use may be
vastly different. You know, like Gregg was mentioning, Mancos have 66-day PHI, long PHI. Well, we may use that on some of our vegetable crops, and it may be less than a week. So just keep in mind that there can be big differences between fruits and vegetables. And, you know, we've probably already said it 3 times. The label is the law.
The label
right?
is the law.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that I tell homeowners, and people will ask me on a regular basis about input on these things, I go and check the label and our publications every time I spray. It's so easy, especially the older I get, Seth. It's so easy to just say, well, I think it's this, and then remember wrong. So, you know, check the label, read the label, follow the label, make good notes, follow up. And so with these grapes, again, they've not been sprayed as regular as they needed. And one thing, I guess, in closing on disease on these, for me, is when we start using fungicides, they're not one and dones. And depending upon rain and weather, and I don't know about where you're at, but here on the plateau, Seth, we've been getting about an inch a day, it seems like, for the last week. And that really puts a lot of pressures on us trying to control disease. And you're spraying on a, 4, 5, 7 day window instead of a 14, maybe 21 day window.
A lot of disease control, you're going to have to do more than just one tool in that toolbox. You're going to want to think about cultural controls as well.
Yep.
So if you can look at the orchard floor right beneath us, very cleaned out here. So we're not seeing any of those mummified, when I mean mummified, berries, that rot will drop some of that grapes down to the floor, and that's where that fungus is going to overwinter in the soil and potentially cause issues down the road the following year. So we did a great job with cultural controls, sanitization of the orchard floor. Any other methods that you might have kept up with
And
that?
why was it easy to keep mummified berries off the floor?
Last year we had no grapes whatsoever.
There we go.
None. And so one thing too, extension agents will start getting all these calls about this black rot coming in. Why are my grape clusters rotting? What can I do? And so we're mid-season and people are starting to see this now and they're wanting to spray. There's not a thing that you can do other than we're at the point of sanitation now, cleaning these out, trying to get rid of this, recognizing that when we start next spring, we have to have a really good spray control program. And so in our notes, we do our homework and we understand, okay, I've got black rot and it's really bad in these particular varieties. This is going to be my approach. I'm going to spray this product starting at this date, which is typically early in the spring when we see these shoots out less than 2 inches in length or approximately 2 inches in length. So you can think how much growth we've got here, how far behind we would be on just spraying those. So again, cultural management, growing fruit crops is not a one-time deal. It is a continuous ongoing process. And so we're going to transition from looking at grapes. We're going to step over and look at some blueberries. So just to give you a little bit of background on these grapes too, this is a bunch of grapes that's been here, goodness gracious, I'll bet you 30 years, probably our original fruit crop, maybe even longer than that. And they even survived the Easter freeze here a few years ago. And as you can tell, blueberries are crazy vigorous plants. And I used to tease my dad every year about he wasn't pruning hard enough. He wasn't pruning hard enough until he took a bush hog and basically mowed back through them to divide a hedgerow of blueberries into 2 rows. And still yet, they're so vigorous. I mean, even as hard as I prune these, I probably need to step my game up. And that's just a mental note that you say, no, too much growth.
You know, there's some pretty mature pains in here. One thing we probably should make sure that we say about these blueberries, especially as you're talking about pruning hard and their high level of vigor, is that this is a mixture of multiple cultivars of rabbit eye. I'm sure there's some tip blue in here. You probably have some Premier, Climax, some of those cultivars that have been on the market for a long time. And so our rabbit eyes are going to be the more vigorous. They're also going to be the larger of our crops, especially when they get to mature size, which is a little bit confusing because they can actually be larger than high bush. But that's kind of the other main category. And we are here in actually the coolest part of Tennessee. And you can see that actually, here we're growing all rabbit eyes. So, there are many reasons why we do that, because of their vigor, because of their relative disease resistance. They tend to be a little bit stronger against some of the cane diseases, but they do bear later in the season. And so you can see, oddly enough, they bear later, but they can actually many times bloom earlier. So there's even a little bit of what would be some cold temperature damage early part of the season. You can see kind of right around the tip of that flower on some of these young berries. And now, as a general statement, some of the older rabbit eyes don't have quite as large of berries, but it's also possible that with a little bit more removal of some of these larger canes, you can also get the berry size up on some of these. So we're just starting to ripen here, and I'll make a couple of comments about fertilization. So for the most part, blueberries are not one of our high nutrient requiring crops. We'll typically do 2 to 3 nitrogen applications during the course of the season. A little, when they really start to, leaf out and fully take up nutrients, as well as, a little bit to help them, retain vigor and set some good buds for next year. But maybe the most interesting and very important timely thing that we want to talk about in the summertime is one of the newer but potentially very devastating insect pests that we can deal with in terms of blueberries. And so we'll bring Seth in here to talk about Drosophila
Suzuki. Yes, that's the genus species name, Drosophila Suzuki. So its common name is spotted wing Drosophila. It's named that because the male will actually have a easy identified spot on its wing. The females do not. But it's the females that are causing the damage. And so unlike a lot of our other fruit flies that really can only penetrate the skin of a blueberry or other fruit when it's overripe and maybe fallen on the orchard floor, unlike those fruit flies, this fruit fly is invasive from Asia, came over to the East Coast, stated the fruit industry, as far as being able to, the female is actually going to oviposit its eggs. And that larva is then going to be in the ripe blueberries. So it's very important to manage. If you have, a row of blueberries like this, you're most likely going to have spotted wing Drosophila pressure. And so some of the best ways to manage and seeing about when a spray might be warranted for this is actually getting a sugar yeast trap. So there's plenty of formulas online to make a homemade sugar yeast trap. Putting it along your row and just seeing about the number of fruit flies that you're catching in there. Some folks like to use sticky traps along with that, so you don't have to dig through that nasty sugar yeast liquid there. Some folks also use a vinegar wine base as well. That sweetness will attract them as well. And that is one of the baits that we would recommend and won't necessarily bring more into the area. So with this pest, there are a few management levels to keep up with. We have one product that we like to use is organic, and that active ingredient is called spinosad. And you can find different common names of it too, but just make sure the active ingredient is spinosad. That is an OMRI certified organic product. OMRI stands for Organic Materials Review Institute, so it is accredited organic. That'll do great, but do keep in mind, once it has already penetrated the blueberry and oviposited its eggs in there, that insecticide is not going to be able to control it. This insecticide is only going to be able to control the adult of that fly. So that's why it's critical that we time this application, just like that Japanese beetle. We need to time it. We're not going to spray as soon as we see a Japanese beetle. We're going to see it as soon as we see maybe a cluster of them and starting to cause some damage. Similar here on the spotted wing Drosophila. We're not going to spray as soon as we see an adult. We're going to see once we get in that traps, getting up to that threshold in that trap, maybe 4 or 5 in that trap, we're going to start spraying. So the hard part about this pest is they can have multiple populations throughout the summer. So it's not going to be a one and done spray. Even though you knock that population down, they can rebound back up, as they can have up to 6 or 7 generations per that summer. And they are able to overwinter in those berries as well. So earlier in the season, our crops like strawberry might get away without having much pressure.
Yeah, and so what Seth is talking about here, they do reproduce very, very quickly, and so it's not a one spray; it's a multi-spray. Monitor. I used to tell homeowners, if you want particularly here on the plateau where our soils are very acidic, blueberries are one of the easiest crops in the world to grow and have some success. But the pH is critical to have success. If you get up above 6, they're not going to do any good whatsoever. So keep that pH low and minimal fertilization, and they'll thrive. One thing to think about is just as soon as these buds come off, we'll be looking at them setting buds for next year. We want to make certain that we keep enough moisture for those to get good bud set for next year's growth on these blueberries.
So you don't have to be irrigated, Greg,
No.
but many times, especially for establishment, we would recommend that you have irrigation or the capacity to get those young plants going off well. And especially for a mature rabbit eye, they're going to be more resilient than what our high bush would be. But keep in mind that blueberries have a relatively shallow root system. And so they're going to be really working off of the main upper few inches. The other thing that's good to mention while we're talking about water is, and I'll quote Dr. Lockwood, he says, "I don't like mulch in fruit plantings, but I will make an exception for blueberry." And so this is a home planting, and so they're working on kind of manually keeping down the weed pressure, but woven ground cover, there can be some other options that we have which can help you out a little bit.
I would definitely recommend the ground cover, putting these in for the blueberries. While it doesn't look like it, this actually received approximately 3 inches of mulch last fall. And so you can see it's already kind of broken down in the ground. If you've seen some of my presentations where I've used some of the blueberries bushes, that's been one of the things we talk about.
We had a question about pruning timing. And so as a general statement, there are some commercial operations that do some, in-season pruning, but for the most part, the bulk of the work that we do will be dormant pruning. And so it's going to be, late February, March, before they break bud, that we're going to be making those decisions about, removing a small percentage of our larger canes every year and letting some of these younger, vigorous canes take over the productivity. You want to throw anything?
Yeah, and one thing. Okay, so Dr. Bumgarner, step over there next to it. She's a lot shorter lady than what I am, but as the pruner guy, they don't seem that tall to me. But when I see my sister out here picking blueberries, I'm like, I probably ought to scale those back just a little bit.
Beautiful berries.
So yeah. And as we know, because of that sunlight, where are those big, beautiful berries going to be found? Right up on the crown. So yes, I need to really kind of scale these back. And so I do the early season pruning prior to the growing season. So most of the time I prune these blueberries in March here on the plateau. So now some of the commercials, you might see them come in and shear the tops of these out after they've picked the berries. But for me, I prune them one time, and that's generally in the springtime. Any other questions? Again, if you've looked at our UT Extension pubs, we talk about those recommended home fruit plantings that we're going to grow. To me, the strawberries, the blueberries are going to be the first two that I'm going to recommend for a homeowner to try and grow. They are the lowest input, while I didn't say nothing about no input. They are going to be a lower input. And even as in lower, there's some maintenance to them and things that you're going to be doing to take care of those plantings. So do not confuse the two. We're going to recommend you to those. Grapes are at the other end of that scale. They are a more intensive, spray regimented. You've got to be on your game, and you've got to be kind of one of those homebodies that likes to be in the garden once a week doing something with that grape crop. You got the busy hands. You've got to be doing something. You may be suited for grapes. If you travel a lot across the country or you're going on weekends, grapes probably isn't your game. Blueberries might be the one that you need to look at, because really the only pest, there are some cane borers and things like that, but really the only pests that we deal with blueberries of any significant level are the spotted wing Drosophila. Okay, so with that, we want to transition over to our caneberries.
Yeah, let's go find some caneberries, guys.
Hey, Greg, can I ask
Yes.
a question while y'all are walking over there?
Yes.
So, so often, when we're in the middle of the growing season is when we see some like foliar signs that maybe our pH isn't right, for blueberries. We start seeing yellowing. In my head, I think, well, this is my visual cue that I need to take action. Would that be correct? Do we need to go ahead and try to amend that now or wait till a different time?
Well, typically the best time to fertilize those, you can fertilize in the spring when that bud is up. I like to use an ammonium sulfate. So the sulfur is going to kind of keep that pH down, but it's also going to work to bump that nitrogen level up. And so the key, though, is really we don't use a whole lot. That ammonium sulfate or the sulfur is going to be the real key for driving down that pH. And so you make a great point with the yellowing of those leaves. They start looking anemic. I have seen homeowners try and grow blueberries in areas where the pH is, above 6.5, and they'll die. Just flat out. They will starve to death and basically die. So the first thing, if you're going to grow blueberries, before you ever even get started, before you ever year -1, is get your pH amended.
So if we're seeing chlorosis on the leaves, certainly amending is good, but there's also a certain level of just honesty that if you're at that point, it's possible that this may not be a long-term productive blueberry.
That's right. We should have got that amended before we ever got started. So really get blueberries. The most critical thing I tell people: get your site prepped, get the pH right before you ever put them in the ground. And if you do that, and those soils are going to try and revert back to what they were. So if you spend enough time and get that pH amended, get it where it's supposed to be, and stable, you can have some success.
We did get another question. We don't have any strawberries to showcase here, but about post-harvest maintenance of strawberries. I can touch on that real quick now if we have time.
Yeah, hey, we love strawberry questions.
Yes, definitely. Renovating strawberries is going to be key immediately after harvest when we can, especially for a June bearing. Our ever bearing, we can maybe wait for that other crop and maybe wait to do that renovation. But renovation, we do have a publication that goes deep into how to, but it's essentially promoting that new growth of that strawberries for those runners to encourage movement out, and potentially clipping out some of those strawberry leaves that could be susceptible to leaf spot and other diseases to be spread for the following year. And as the strawberries start to age, getting to years 4 or 5, it might be smart to, actually take out those strawberries that might not be productive for the following year and replacing those.
I think that's a really good point to bring up, in the fact that, for those of us who grew up in more northern climates, we had strawberries that lasted for years. And the further south you get, the harder these perennial crops of strawberries are. And so, yes, renovation is good, absolutely, to reduce anthracnose and things like that. But I also think that, sometimes we can take a few lessons from our commercial growers who replace, every year. And there may be times when 10 years is too much to expect out of our strawberry crops.
Right. But probably the biggest mistake that I see a homeowner make with strawberries, and I'm talking matted row strawberries, is when they're done bearing, they do nothing. And literally, we're going to tell you to go in and mow those strawberries back to about 4 or 6 inches. And then we're going to tell you to take a garden tiller and go down both sides of that row of strawberries and till them all up. And then we're going to tell you to mulch or fertilize them and let them go. Because what homeowners fail to remember is those strawberries are going to put berries on the runners that they produce. And if you let them just continue to grow and grow and grow and never kill them out, never get rid of those runners, at some point in time, you will have a new game called let's find the berry. And they'll be hidden away somewhere in this giant mat of green foliage. So renovate, 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 renovate. Will help you
We
a long
actually
time.
have a good question that kind of goes back to the blueberries, but before we jump into caneberries, I think let's just go ahead and address it. And so the question is from somebody who's moved to a new home, and they have some very mature blueberries that, as you were having me reach up, you're a little bit too tall to pick. And so the question really is, do we prune from the top or do we prune from the bottom? And so our answer is almost always going to be low.
Yeah. I would say yes, because one, I want to get them up. Again, I don't want berries. And even on the cane fruit here, I don't want berries on the ground. Who wants to stoop over and pick berries? Two, from a food safety issue, we don't want berries being harvested right on the ground. So we're going to prune, we're going to try and get the canopy up. But at the same time, we want to minimize the height of that canopy. It's going to set most of its fruit up on the high side where all the sunlight hits and really, really energizes those fruit buds. And so that's where most of the fruit's going to be. We don't want it picking up here at 7 feet. We want them at a height. And so depending upon your height, that's generally probably what I would prune those berries to fit your height. So,
and also think about the fact that when you prune berries, they're going to keep branching, right? This is a woody plant, it's perennial. And so if you prune high, then you're just going to get little branches from there.
Yes, correct. All right. So want to talk a little bit about the caneberries. So the strawberries and the blueberries are the first two that I'm going to say, hey, this is where we need to go in terms of fruit. But I love the caneberries too. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for home growers doing caneberries. Now, the level of care increases. And as you can see, when we talk about caneberries, in this case, blackberries, we have got it's a biennial. And so we've got the primary cane that is growing this year. And then we've got the secondary cane that sets fruit. And as I shake that, we see the Japanese beetles fly out of, and these have not been sprayed. And as Dr. Bumgarner moves in on some of the fruit, you can see damage from two different things. This is insect feeding, but at the same time, we've got insect feeding on the leaves, but we've also got some fungal issues going on this. And these canes are really kind of nearing the end of their lives. And before long, when I finish picking these, I'm going to immediately get these canes out because they've been in here 2 years. They're a vast harbinger for disease.
Yeah. And let's back up and hit one physiological note before we jump into some of the differences. So we know that the traditional growing habit for caneberries is, right, a 2-year cane. And so, Gregg pointed out the difference between the first year, the primocane, the second year, the floricane. And so, once we get to this point, they will have completed their life cycle. They will die after they, finish off this fruit crop. Now, there's really I think of it kind of as two ways that we can deal with some of the challenges that we see. Number one, we can spray a little bit harder. And lots of times when we talk about blackberries, we say it is not something that we have a spray calendar for. But if you start seeing some of those cane diseases, anthracnose, which can be on the canes, it can also be on the leaves, then fungicides are warranted. So maybe we'll talk about that option. And then we'll talk about the other option, which is going to a primocane fruiting. You want to talk any about some of your fungicide possibilities?
Okay, so in these, you're going to be really kind of, as a homeowner, you're going to be limited in a lot of your sprays. And if you look at these caneberries here, they are basically for lack of better term, almost a no spray. And you can see what happens when you get into a no spray. You get a lot of disease. You got a lot of insect pressures. I will hit these with a permethrin. These haven't been sprayed. And as a result, there's lots of insect feeding damage on it. And so, if I want big, clean, undisturbed berries, I got to spray. And, I would tell you to go to a home fruit disease and insect control spray guide. It's recently been renovated. And so some of those currents, but always check the label. Even with the guide, always check the label. And so it's just one of those crops that you're going to have to spray to kind of keep the insect pressure down from feeding on your caneberries on the plants and reducing the plant disease problems.
All right. So with that kind of introduction into the floricane bearers, why don't we walk down the row and talk about a little bit about primocane bearers?
Okay. So with the primocane bearers, the University of Arkansas is the 800-pound gorilla when it comes to developing blackberries, caneberries. And so a lot of their new varieties are actual primocane fruiting blackberries. And so what I mean by primocane is they will actually fruit on this year's crop. And here's an example of a smaller one. Dr. Bumgarner's, if you look at this right here, it's already producing flowers. This is this year's growth. This cane has grown this year, and actually here in late summer is going to set fruit, and it's going to produce fruit for the fall. These caneberries last year on the plateau were actually trying to set fruit in November. And I think if I would have covered them or had some type of cold frame over them, I probably could have had caneberries at Christmas time. But again, with freeze and frost, it's going to continue to kill those back. Here in the or on the plateau and in some of these colder climates in Tennessee, this probably will not work for West Tennessee and likely might not work for Middle Tennessee. But my cropping next year, when these are done bearing fruit this fall, I'm mowing everything to the ground.
Yeah. So as Gregg mentioned, if the primocane bearers almost seem too good to be true, their Achilles heel is that their late season fruit set, this is what they're looking at right here, your late summer to fall yield, can be heavily impacted and reduced by summertime heat. And so even in Arkansas, right, that developed these cultivars, that's not the best growing region. In fact, Arkansas makes a pretty good amount of money selling these berries to the Pacific Northwest. We should also recognize that when we're talking about ourselves as home gardeners, we may be willing to deal with a little bit of a reduction in yield for the sake of simplicity in crop and disease management.
Anthracnose tends to be the big problem that I deal with in these. And if you look at the biennials, which are crazy heavy producers, but boy, they've got a lot more maintenance to them in terms of reducing that disease pressure. This fall, after these, and when I start hitting regular frost or get a good frost, I'm just going to mow everything back to the ground, clean everything up. I will probably put down some landscape fabric to let those come up through it to control my vegetation a little bit more. A lot of times I'll get in here once or twice a year on my hands and just kind of pull it out. It doesn't look like it, but actually this in probably mid-April was bare soil. There was not a weed to be found anywhere in any of this. So yeah, so you can look and see how vegetation and good soil and moisture, that stuff can take off. But as a part of my disease control measure, I'm just going to mow them to the ground, and I'm going to just produce that late summer and fall crop just to reduce anthracnose problems in my caneberries.
We talked about SWD in blueberries, but we shouldn't completely turn off that thought when we think about caneberries, right, Seth?
That's right. The blackberries are almost just as susceptible as the blueberries. They have a little bit more of those crevices that they're able to really oviposit their eggs into. So do keep in mind that you can also keep track, especially if you're doing multiple types of fruit. You can have a SWD population, go from blackberry to blueberry. It's easy as that. So if they're nearby, you might want to think about a trap between them, or sugar yeast trap between them as well. Other pests to keep in mind are the cane borer. That comes hand in hand when anthracnose. Usually they're going to attack the weaker canes. So that's why it's always important when you're doing your cultural controls to really promote that healthy canes and removing those canes that might show disease pressure.
If you find cane borer, the way you get rid of cane, you prune it out. That's right. Right then and
probably go down there on those floor canes and find some swollen canes that look like they may be.
Yeah, you might, because if I found any, in which I have found them here in the past, but every year I'll find them, I prune them out right then. Okay. So Yeah, just good management and sanitation from that standpoint. The last thing I would leave everybody with is just, again, there's a reason why I entitled a program years ago, Fruits of Labor, because to get fruit, it is a labor. Now, it can be a labor of love. If you love gardening and you love doing this and you love reaping your own fruit, it can be a wonderful, rewarding endeavor. However, if you're wanting just to grow fruit to maybe save a little bit of money or something like that, I tell you, do not complain when you go to the grocery store about high fruit prices, because there's a lot of work, effort, and energy that goes into growing fruit crops.
No, I think that's great. We actually have one question in the Q&A that I just now saw, and we can jump in. Two questions in one day, Seth. We're going back to yours.
Yeah.
So it is about renovating in containers.
Okay.
And I would say for containers, in many ways it gets simpler, right? The reason that we use a tiller is just because it's too large to do by hand. So our goal with renovation is to kind of shift our production from the parent to the daughter plants. So if what you have, are plants in containers with some runners, you could remove some of the older plants. Is there anything you want to throw in about that?
Yeah, I mean, containers are a great way to actually manage exactly how you want that fruit to grow. So, I've seen them trellising down those containers too in different methods, but I think just following the same practices like Natalie had mentioned would work well with that. Yep.
Oh, and we've got a great question from Aaron about primocane bearers. So, do you know, Gregg, is this a freedom?
This is, I think it's Primark Freedom.
Yeah.
Yes.
So to answer your question a little bit, Aaron, there are, by now 3, 4, 5 primocane bearers. So Prime Jim and Prime Jan were a first couple that came onto the market. I think some of the newer ones we can probably get a little bit better taste quality out of. So this is Primark Freedom, and it is a thornless cane. Primark 45 is going to be a thorny primocane bearer, and there's also Primark
Traveler. And there one of these may be Primark Traveler.
Yeah. And so at this point in time, I should say we have trials, in ground in multiple parts of the state to make sure that we know a really good answer to this. But at this point in time, Freedom would be a good place to start. It tends to be a little bit softer berry. Traveler has developed a little bit more for the shipping market, and so it might be a little bit firmer berry. But those would be good places to begin.
Yep. Good place to end.
On that. Yep, exactly.
All right. So it looks to me like we have cleared out the chat box. I want to thank Gregg and Kay, of course, for hosting us this morning. It has been a ton of fun to visit with you all. We love going out and talking fruit. And we look forward to seeing you again next month on our third Thursday for Master Gardeners. We'll actually see you next week on Friday.
You bet. UT Horton. Check us out.
Check us out.
All right. Have a great day. We'll see y'all soon.